In this episode of the Cole Memo, I'll be sitting down with Dan Linn and my friend Phil. I've been trying to make this podcast happen for, I think, years at this point. I've been so excited to chat with Dan. I'm looking forward to get to know Dan a bit more. This episode is going to be awesome. I'm going to send you right into this week's episode. But before I do that, a little bit about the sponsors who made this episode possible. If you go to riverbluffcollective.com and you're over 21 years of age or older, you can buy edibles, tinctures, and beverages that can be sent straight to your door, absolutely legally. Once again, that's riverbluffcollective.com. You might all know that I love the Bluff Punch Pops, which pack a punch, and I recommend only for veteran users. If you're cannabis curious or if you just prefer lower doses, they do have low dosed beverages as well. So you don't have to go all out with a River Bluff Punch Pop. You can get a lower dosed punch pop, or they even offer specific low dosed drinks. The point is, they have doses for every person who wishes to consume cannabis safely. Once again, please consume these products responsibly, and you must be 21 years of age or older to order. Finally, if you're not listening to this episode on Patreon, then you're listening to this episode a bit later than our patrons. To become a patron, go to colememo.com/Patreon. That's colememo.com/Patreon. This show is brought to you by listeners like you. You can also support this show by simply liking, subscribing, reviewing favorably, or sharing with your friends. Your engagement and support is appreciated. Enjoy this episode of The Cole Memo. All right, Phil, happy Halloween. How's it going?
Happy Halloween. How's it going?
Doing great, doing great. Excited for an awesome show. You sparking up today?
Of course, always.
Right, and I'm guessing that weed's from Illinois, right?
It exists in Illinois.
All right, yeah. We always make a joke. We love to go to Michigan every once in a while to get cannabis. Anyways, we're joined today by Dan Linn. Dan, please say hi to the audience.
Oh, hello, audience, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm looking forward to an exciting conversation.
Yeah. Really been looking forward to connect with you folks. Once again, you're tuned into the Cole Memo. If you're wondering why the show's called the Cole Memo, Google it. It's a fun little fact about cannabis policy. Anyways, speaking of cannabis policy, we'll be talking about cannabis policy, psychedelic policy, and maybe more. But I just thought, Dan, maybe we could start with having you introduce yourself and just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Dan Linn, and for a long time I ran the Illinois chapter of NORML to work on legalizing cannabis in Illinois. And my current role is I'm one of the board members for the Illinois Psychedelic Society, pushing to legalize therapeutic use of psilocybin and other psychedelic substances.
Awesome. And thank you for the work that you do. I thought maybe it'd be cool to maybe start with cannabis policy. But before we do that, since the Cure Act and psychedelic policy is in the sphere of conversation, do you want to just give a quick plug for the Cure Act and tell people maybe how they can find out more information about it?
Yeah, well, they can definitely go to the Illinois Psychedelic Society website. But basically, the Cure Act would allow patients suffering from mental health problems to be able to legally acquire psychedelic substances, but they would have to use them in what they're calling a service center. It wouldn't be like cannabis policy where they're buying it at a dispensary and taking it home with them. All of the substances would have to be done under supervision at one of the service centers, with the small exception of people who are terminally ill or unable to physically go to the service centers. Then it could be done in the privacy of that individual's home.
Yeah. So folks are wanting to look it up. It's House Bill 1, the Cure Act, right?
Yeah, there's also a Senate version as well. State Senator Rachel Ventura is the sponsor, and then State Representative LaShawn Ford is the sponsor of House Bill 1.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm sure we'll circle back to that, but I just wanted to give it a quick shout out at the top of the episode, since I know it's developing policy and you just recently had a town hall for it, or a panel rather. So wanted to give that quick plug. But like I say, Phil, I thought it'd be interesting to start. Let's rewind the tape, go back to the Illinois NORML days. Tell us about how you got into cannabis policy.
Really, it was in high school doing legalization papers and speeches, and then I went to college and did the same speeches over and again, a little bit longer, a little bit more in depth, and started volunteering my time with the organization. And I thought in the big city of Chicago, there'd be people working on this day and night, but it was really just a handful of individuals loosely connected through the internet across the state. And, I was trying to say, if we're going to change these laws, we need to be in Springfield and lobbying. And over the course of 15, probably closer to 20 years, we were able to get some policies changed. And here we are now in a state that has the legal use for adults to be able to purchase it. At least it is still illegal for adults to grow their own, other than the medical patients, which is definitely something I would like to see changed and continue to improve upon this legislation. But yeah, it was really just doing papers and speeches, and then getting involved in the state and local political realm, because that's where you can make the biggest difference.
Yeah. And you said 15 to 20 years. What was it like? I mean, we're talking the
I mean, this was the late
2000s.
'90s, early
Okay.
2000s. People weren't taking the issue serious. You got a lot of jokes, you got a lot of puns. The media coverage was kind of slanted in terms of mocking the issue. But we had a lot of excellent patients, and we had some excellent advocates as well that were dedicated to this issue, going to the Capitol in Springfield, meeting with lawmakers, explaining their situation, talking about how this is medicine that helps them. This is getting them off of the prescription pills they were taking. And they didn't feel that they should be treated as criminals and having to go to the illegal market to be able to buy this medicine. They wanted safe and legal access. And over time and a number of failed votes and failed attempts, we were able to get the law passed, which was a very narrow pilot program requiring patients to go through background checks and paying pretty significant patient fees just to get the card to be able to get this medicine legally. And now, fast forward, and all adults can purchase it legally. The taxes are still very significant, and still allowing that gray market, that legacy market, to exist in Illinois. But that's the legislative process. We aimed for the best that we could do, and slowly we chiseled away at prohibition, and eventually it came crumbling down, with a few exceptions, such as adults being able to grow their own in their backyards.
Yeah. What what was that process of compromise like, because I've always heard that Illinois created Generation 2 of cannabis, which is limited licensed, highly compliance focused markets where, let's call Generation 1 California, 1996, Prop 215, where there's no seed to sale. It's caregiver, largely caregiver supported or supplied. And here we are with Illinois. What was that push and pull like? Because as you said, the first medical program was super limited, and
Yeah.
background checks that you had to pay for yourself, and it's just so many crazy things in
Yeah, I
retrospect.
mean, the big difference was, the Generation 1, as you said, a lot of those states went through the ballot initiative process, where the voters got to choose on election day. They decided that they supported it, and then it was kind of up to the lawmakers to figure it out after the voters decided it. Whereas in Illinois, it was the lawmakers deciding it from the beginning, because we don't have a binding referendum process in the state of Illinois. So you had a lot of lawyers looking at this, dreaming up every what if scenario. You had a lot of input from law enforcement, who really were the biggest opponents to this legislation for a long time. There were some other organized religious groups opposed to it, but really it was law enforcement that made this such a restrictive program in the beginning. And then that's where, because they had such a strong seat at the table, they were able to make it so restrictive. And then by limiting the amount of licenses, that was going to drive up the price, because it's basic microeconomics. You're starting to see more dispensaries and licenses come online now, but even now we're almost 10 years after medical became a law in Illinois. 4 years going on 5 for adult use, and you're just now starting to slowly see more dispensaries come online. The craft growers are starting to produce products. But it really is, as you said, with the Generation 2, the limited licensing I mean, it's great for the people that are looking to make a lot of money from this from an investment standpoint, but in terms of consumers, we're still paying top dollar in Illinois for a product that some would argue is inferior to some of the other states that have lots of competition and lots of people breeding different strains, being able to produce a wider variety of products. But in Illinois, we had to take what we could get, and that was with a very restrictive medical program. That was initially just a pilot program. It was really just a test to see if this was going to be okay, make sure the sky didn't fall in. And now it's a permanent program. Adult use is permanent. But it's really the legislative process that required us to make those compromises. And then over time, we've been able to kind of reverse some of those compromises, loosen up the program a little bit. But obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done to make this a consumer-friendly law in Illinois.
Yeah. Bill, I want to give you the space. Any thoughts or anything? I've been kind of.
I was just gonna say, like, yeah, like that Illinois state police lobby seems like they have a lot of power.
Yeah, and it really, to be honest, it wasn't really the state police because they're controlled by the governor. And really, if the governor was supportive, the governor didn't want his own police force to be opposed to this. So, I mean, I remember the day the Illinois State Police went neutral. We literally found out in the lunch line at the cafeteria where the state police lobbyist, who I had a good relationship with, he was in front of us in the lunch line, and he's just like, "Oh yeah, we went neutral on your bill." And I was like, "What?" And he's just like, "Yeah, we didn't make any like press release or anything, but we went neutral on the bill because the governor was expecting it to get to his desk, and he was going to sign it if we did." We didn't get that legislation through that year specifically, but the bigger law enforcement lobbies in Illinois that really kind of dragged their feet on this until the very end would be like the Sheriff's Association, the Chiefs of Police Association, the Fraternal Order of Police. All of those groups were up in arms about this issue. And, a lot of it has to come from where they get their funding from, using cannabis as a foot in the door to search somebody, with their car or just in their person. But now you could talk to them even back then in private, and they knew that this wasn't a big issue. They don't have any stories of their buddies getting into fights with people consuming cannabis. They got stories of drunk people getting into fights with them and their colleagues, but never was cannabis really an issue for them on a personal or a private level. But from an organizational standpoint, because it was such a foundational part of their funding and for how they were able to do their jobs in terms of being able to get those searches and stopping people. That's why it was such a important thing for them.
Yeah, because like as far as like scent and stuff for probable cause or people needing medical cards to grow at home, it seems like there's certain groups of police in the state that just really want to keep their foot in the door, being able to like come into your house if they see a couple plants in a window, or get into your car if they smell you have weed in the car.
Yeah, and even now we're starting to see the laws and the judges kind of rule. Does the smell of raw cannabis in somebody's car justify a police officer searching them? And also, does the smell of burnt cannabis give them that same justification? And you're seeing this in other states where it's kind of slowly becoming less of an issue. In Illinois, because you're still not allowed to consume in a vehicle, the police are still going to hold on to that, I think, as long as they can. If they smell burnt cannabis in a car, they're going to want to toss the car, see everybody's IDs, and see what else they can find on you.
Yeah, well said. And just a quick plug, I'll throw this link in the show notes for listeners that are interested. We did a podcast episode on the recent Supreme Court hearing with a couple of lawyers that are familiar with the details of the cases. So if you're looking to learn more on the latest, at least latest as of September 27th, 2024, check that out. It's episode 130 of the Cole Memo. We'll have that in the show notes. Yeah, it's a interesting place we're in. And, one of the things that I find interesting is like you say, we had to, with any political debate, sometimes you walk away from the table not getting everything you want, right? You have to get concessions. I think it is interesting, how law enforcement not only lobbied for an extremely restrictive program, but in some ways, like based on reporting from the Chicago Tribune, licensed operators kind of fell in line with that. In fact, a lot of the established licensees attribute the foundation of their success to this cannabis generation 2.0 market. And it's like awfully convenient, I guess is what I'm saying for them, you
Yeah,
know.
and we kind of knew that this was going to take place. I mean, it just turned into a protectionism. You know, if there's a limited amount of licenses, they don't want more competition. They were able to pool their money together and say we should be the only ones allowed to sell recreationally for X amount of years. Because they knew that even after the law passed, even after adult use sales started, by the time the state issues the licenses, by the times the buildings get built, by the times the plants get harvested, they still had a huge runway of time to make money hand over fist and get that first mover advantage, which was important for their business model.
Right. Right. Bill, any thoughts on this? I just wanted to give you space because I've been throwing a lot of questions his way. So if not, I've got more.
I mean, I guess just that, like, because you were doing this for like a long time before any of the practical aspects of legalization came to. Did you ever have any concept of like limited licensing back in like like 2010?
I mean, we knew that that was probably going to be the politically feasible thing to do. There was one conversation at one point where we were going to put one license in each state Senate district. But given the political corruption in Illinois, they thought, let's not tie the licenses to a legislative body. And that kind of morphed into the one cultivation center per state police district.
Yeah.
That's kind of how that foundation was laid. Was just like each state police director then for those districts has one cultivation center in their area, and their success in terms of the state police director for that district was tied to making sure that that cultivation center was not operating outside of the law and selling out the back door, so to say.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was a vocal advocate for more licenses, lowering the barriers to entry. Even now, I still think that when I hear the governor or other people talking about how we have the most equitable law in the nation, I would say that if we had more licenses, that may be true. Because I was a manager of a couple dispensaries at one time. I had a consulting company at one time, but I was trying to get licenses for a dispensary, and we just didn't. We didn't win those licenses, but a lot of it ended up just in a lottery. By pure luck does somebody get a license. But then if you look at how those lotteries were operated,
I was going to say lottery.
You could have multiple entries. The first round of lotteries, you saw people putting 5, 10, 15 applications in, and only in the more recent ones did they limit how many districts could you apply or how many licenses could you have per district. Because when you had a lot of wealthy people, the $5,000 an entry into the lottery isn't a big barrier for a lot of wealthy people pooling their money. They're not really stuffing the ballot box, but they're definitely giving themselves the statistically best chances of winning that lottery. And that's why when it comes down to equity in trying to help people that want to get involved in this industry and having lower barriers to entry, I think having more licenses available is more equitable. And then you allow competition and the free market principles of which businesses are successful and which businesses aren't successful to take place, as opposed to making it such a limited licensing so that anybody that has a license, that's a way to make money in and of itself. I mean, there are people who won these applications who just turned around and sold that piece of paper, metaphorically, just sold that license because they knew it was just such a valuable opportunity that there were people willing to pay top dollar just to get the license, even before the business was operational at all.
Yeah, it's insane.
I looked up some super old clip of you. I don't know what it was on, but you were talking about like what Illinois Normal's model for like legalization was back then. And it was like essentially it sounded like anyone who wanted a license to grow would pay like $100, and then you would have these dispensaries who would have to buy from these licensed producers.
Yeah, I
Which
mean, we
almost
had a
sounded
lot
like
of crazy ideas.
It almost sounded like a
the idea
caregiver
that I still
dispensary
like
model,
is,
kind of.
kind of like the fishing license model in Illinois.
Right.
It's a nominal fee. I think fishing licenses in Illinois are like $15. It doesn't require you to jump through a lot of hoops, but you pay that little bit of a fee, and then you could grow your own, and then have like farmers markets or county fairs where people could trade this, and deal amongst themselves more or less. Obviously the government doesn't like that because there's no regulations or not as many. There's not a good way to collect the taxes on it. And then another type of licensing scheme that we tossed around and that I would still love to see in Illinois is kind of like a nursery license. Not necessarily a cultivation center, maybe kind of like as an attachment to a craft grow license where they're selling like clones or seeds or tissue sample out the door, and just selling clones basically to anybody that wants to buy and grow their own. I definitely think that there's room in the Illinois market, especially for a license like that, where people who, they have maybe 5 or 6 strains that they've been breeding for a long time that are excellent strains. Let's get those genetics out in the public, and having a nursery style license, would allow for that, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like, just to, dwell on the topic of limited licensing for a second, it sounds like you see the topic of social equity as like accessibility to the market, uh, trying to think of other ways to put it, as opposed to the way the Illinois state government has pitched it, and even several people from Illinois state government, including the Cannabis Regulation Oversight Officer, Governor Pritzker himself, has said that social equity is market share. It's this concept of, they basically have paired the concept of limited licensing with social equity, which Phil and I like to say it's like they're antithetical concepts to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the concept of equity, trying to reverse or right some of the harms of the war on drugs that were disproportionately felt in certain communities of color and impoverished neighborhoods and people. I definitely think that there is good reason that we should be catering to those people having a foot in the door and getting a leg up in this industry. But I also think that at a certain point, if the federal government changes these laws, they're going to have to compete, just like the big players in Illinois are going to have to compete with Colorado and Washington State and California. And if you're kind of just propping them up for a little while, in the long run, you're not doing them any favors, because the pricing in Illinois is still propped up because of the limited licensing and then the additional tax rackets, or the tax brackets for what these products are being taxed at.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why I always thought like a real social equity model would have been like a Michigan Caregiver program, like where people can essentially grow a number of plants in like their garage or their basement and maybe pay their mortgage. Like it's not going to be generational wealth, but like it'll give you enough to maybe pay for your house.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what the real trade-off is, right? Like, do you want to have a smaller number of people get generational wealth from the change in this law, or do you want to try and bring up a lot of communities that the only economic driving force in their neighborhood has been standing on the corner and selling cannabis or selling other substances?
Right.
Where I live in Chicago, there's open air drug markets, just about a couple blocks in any direction. Some of those people are still selling cannabis, but if you want to try and give them an economic opportunity, having a lottery that allows for an additional 110 dispensaries isn't going to help them.
Right.
Because in a way, you're almost like screwing over those people by removing the cannabis market that was in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the terms that
replacing,
I've talked to is, you need to have like a replacement economy, and then that's a tough concept for some people to wrap their heads around. But if you're going to take out this financial rug, you need to replace it with something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, like, in, not to keep using Michigan as an example, but it's almost like they've made it so easy to participate in the market, not only as a aspiring business person, but as a consumer. You're like, almost silly to not just participate in it, right? Like there's no markets like that. I mean, at least I don't think they're like a huge thing. There is a caregiver scene, right? But it's different, I guess, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I mean, and if you want market participation from the consumer standpoint, you want to make it easily accessible. You want to make the pricing reasonable as well, because if you're going to make people drive 45 minutes or an hour to the closest dispensary, and then they're going to get there and it's going to be 2 or 3 times what they could buy it off the street for still, you're not giving them a good reason to keep buying from the dispensary. I mean, unless they're looking for a very specific product, unless they're very concerned about the safety regulations and the testing of what goes into it, or just like the homogeny of the chocolate bars and gummies and stuff like that.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing that comes up from time to time. I don't mean to take us on a tangent, but Phil and I were talking about the idea that I mean, it's almost like a cliche thing people used to say about cannabis before it was legal in a lot of states. Nobody dies from cannabis. Cannabis is like the most harmful thing about cannabis is getting caught with it. And again, I'm not saying there isn't a need for a testing system or anything like that. I think there's a lot of improvements, in fact, we need to make to our testing system. I think that might go without saying. Um, but I don't know, this idea that the illicit market is toxic is an interesting concept that has come out of legalization, where it's like, when did that start? Just because
Yeah,
people
and
got licenses, that's when it became toxic, you know?
yeah, I mean, and that's kind of you look at who's trumpeting those kind of
Hmm.
those ideas out there. I mean, you see one of the vice presidential candidates talking about fentanyl laced cannabis, even though he's kind of admitted that that wasn't a big thing, but it's still a good talking point at rallies. Um, because at a certain point, there's always going to be a boogeyman with these substances, and it takes time to get the general public to realize that uh, there are problems, but it's not as bad as some people make it out to be.
Right. Right. And again, not to take us on too much of a tangent, but I do think it's funny that like I was even in a psychedelic conversation today with psychedelic people from other states, people involved in psychedelic policy, and the discussion of, testing the gummies and the chocolates that are becoming more popular with, mushrooms came up, and they were like, we need to get it like cannabis. Like cannabis, like testing is perfect. Like if we get to that place with mushrooms, like we're gonna be somewhere. And I'm like, I just had to like, I'm like, I'm not trying to like start a debate or anything, but just Google like THC inflation, lab shopping. Like just Google that. I don't. I'm gonna just keep it at that,
Yeah.
and like you'll see there's a lot of issues with cannabis
It is
testing.
really funny you mentioned that because I saw an article the other day that was talking about mushroom strength, like psychedelic mushrooms, and how they've gotten stronger over the years. And I was like, oh, where have I heard this before?
Yeah.
Like we all got to start being sure we're not taking those super strong mushrooms.
Yeah, I mean, some of those arguments are just they're getting as old as we are. I feel like it's they're just tired arguments. I feel also that these markets are still relatively new and like immature. Like
Right.
as these policies get to be 10, 15, 20 years old, you'll start to see better labs. You'll start to see them become more standardized, I guess is the word that I'm looking for. But the guy in his dorm room making brownies, and the corner brownie is 15 times stronger than one of the middle ones. I mean, that was definitely an issue and a concern, but we're just not, you don't see it as much in the regulated market.
Right. And, it's interesting because there's a lot of conversation right now at a national level, just to kind of close out this topic that I took us on a tangent on, like about implementing reference testing labs, like state-based testing labs to check these third-party testing labs. I'm displaying an article that I wrote a few weeks ago, I think, and or it's 2 days ago. Um, but MJ Biz Daily reported that many states, including Illinois, are establishing labs. And I just think it's interesting. They're basically saying like this is a best practice. It should be standard across all state regulated cannabis markets. It's like the quietest admission, in my opinion, that there's a problem with cannabis testing. right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's
And
a
I mean, especially from a consumer standpoint, some customers are shopping just for the strongest strains of
right.
flower they can find. They just want to see whatever that number is on the menu be the highest that it is, and that's the one they're going to buy. Um, and the market has kind of reacted that way, where the cultivators know that there's different tricks that they can do to get an inflated testing result. The testing labs know that it's in their best interest to make these customers happy, which are the
Right.
growers. Um, and really, it's the consumers that are getting the short end of the stick from it.
Right. And that's the thing that you just said right there that somebody recently said to me. It's like, look, Cole, it's as simple as there's a profit motive and this is a business. They can say third party independent lab, a lot of words that make it seem like you have no association with this person, but you very much pick and choose this person. And like you say, often stick with that person if they give you favorable results, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. One hand
So
washes the other in that relationship for sure.
yeah, it's just
Well, and
interesting.
you almost wonder if if public health and safety was like the real goal of this testing, if it wouldn't be like not an end product testing thing, but would almost be like they test it where you're growing. Like they go and they inspect your grows to see that you don't have powdery mildew and like all this or pests going on in your plants. Like, why is it that we have to test it only once at the end? And you're only picking like a couple nugs out of this batch here and there. It just seems like such a weird, flawed process.
If you're interested in learning more about the science of cannabis cultivation, testing, and quality control, check out episode number 112 of the Cole Memo. We talk about what Phil just alluded to. Why don't we do tests throughout the plant's life cycle instead of just in product testing? Check out episode 112 if you'd like to learn more about that subject from a subject matter expert. Let's get back to the episode. I'll rewind the tape just a bit so that we can pick up where we left off.
Why is it that we have to test it only once at the end? And you're only picking like a couple nugs out of this batch here and there. It just seems like such a weird, flawed process.
Yeah, and I mean, at least when I was still working in the cannabis industry in Illinois, I mean, they would come and take some clippings from time to time, but again, the person doing that has a relationship with the head grower who's showing them around. I mean, we used to hear rumors. I don't know if this ever happened, but before they would get the lab guy in there to cut some of these, they'd have other people sprinkling keef on some of the buds, and and I never saw that in person, but that was always a rumor that kind of went through the legal industry at points when you'd see some crazy numbers of low 30s, mid 30s strain of flower from a grower that's been operating for a year and a half. Like that's pretty remarkable if that was the case.
Yeah, it's like
Also,
you get one that's like in the 50s. It's like a kid who's trying to pretend stick who put his thermometer by a light bulb.
Yeah.
It's like your fever's 120, huh?
that's funny. Yeah, so it's just interesting. One of the things, Dan, I didn't want to mention this to you at the beginning of the show because I didn't want to like make it awkward, but I've been really excited to talk to you for quite a while because I've just heard how involved you were and I've heard so many good things about you in cannabis policy, and so just wanted to thank you again for your time today. And I'm just
No, thank
curious.
you, Cole. I appreciate that. I know that you know, coming from a consumer advocate standpoint, I definitely would say I burned some bridges, with how much I was pushing home cultivation in the early years, how much I was talking about the limited licenses being problematic.
Well,
And I don't want
thank
to say
you
that
for
I was
burning those
blacklisted.
bridges.
Yeah,
I don't want to say that I was blacklisted from the industry, but at least with the big fish, they knew who they were going to get if they were ever going to offer me a job.
right.
But we
Gotcha.
changed some laws, and people are able to access this legally. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Well, and just, I mean, people forget, like, even though shit kind of sucks cannabis wise in Illinois, like, we have come a long way from where we were. Like, I looked up some public access interview you did, and it's like hard to believe that the cannabis conversation in, say 2013 was the way it was.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I was pen pals with a person who was doing a 30-year sentence for cannabis trafficking in Illinois, and We were pen pals while he was in prison for about 12 years, I believe. And then he did 15 of his 30 and was able to get released. He has since gone on to do great things with his life. But for 12 years, I was, once every month or two getting a letter from a complete stranger who was doing a heavy sentence for cannabis trafficking. And, over 12 years, we became friends and good old fashioned pen pals.
And that person today, if they had been caught for the same thing, would probably still get the same jail sentence, pretty much, right?
Yeah. I mean, this was Central Illinois. He got a Class X felony. He got a Class 1 felony and a Class 3 felony. And the judge literally said, "I'm going to make an example of you." And lo and behold, a cultivation center opened up within 30-minute drive of the prison that he spent most of his sentence at. So, strange world, I suppose.
Very. Yeah. And just if I could, I'm going to take just 5 seconds to say that if you haven't voted yet, one of the things I just did, I'm not even about to make I'm just look up your judges that you can vote for and look up their names and the word cannabis. I found a few of mine that were running and they've put people away after legalization for cannabis possession and trafficking, like you say. So didn't vote for them. And I encourage you to do the same research when you go to the ballot box. So there's several services online where you can see your ballot ahead of time if you didn't know. Do the research before you get in there. Search up these people and what they do. Yeah. Well, anyways, the point that I was wrapping around to was exactly what you just said. Like, I feel like, and obviously, like right now, it's probably hard to answer this question, but it's like, yeah, I feel like I have a lot to learn from you because I feel like a similar trajectory where I'm talking about these concepts. And as you've experienced, I've not been received with open arms, let's just say, with, some of my opinions on like limited licensing and the continued criminalization of cannabis. So, that was a long way of saying, like I say, I think I can learn a lot from you, possibly.
Yeah, but I mean, you also have to do what you feel is right, and follow your heart and follow your brain. The people that are making lots of money, they probably started from a lot of money, or they had a pretty good advantage to get involved in this industry. I mean, I know some people that were able to get a license and then they cashed out and literally moved to a more friendly state and kind of did it all over again, but didn't cash out. But it's you gotta work with the beast that we have in Illinois, and because we have to go through the legislature for all of this, we're going to continue to see some of these issues. I feel for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the interesting things that Phil and I talk about, and I've even tracked like recently, and it's hard to track this stuff. So when I say I've tracked it, I like do my best, but it's hard to track this stuff because there's a lot of information about cannabis licensees that are protected under confidentiality and CRTA. But what do you remember about like, and it probably wasn't anything you saw, but maybe it was the run up to legalization? The Tribune talked about how in 2017 a federal judge overturned campaign finance laws, and all of a sudden there was just this pouring in of money and
Well, yeah,
lobbyists.
like because you were there before 2017 when it was
Right.
illegal for these companies to make contributions. And then you were still there post, like, was there a noticeable difference in
I mean, you'd see it.
lobbyists and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, the lobbying world in Springfield is kind of interesting in the sense that you have some people like myself that were there for like one organization or one company or one cause. And then you have other hired guns that, they got 5 or 6 clients that they're working on each of those 5 or 6 issues. And sometimes you just wouldn't realize that some of the major players that are lobbyists down there, they got a cannabis contract. And then somebody else has a cannabis contract. And one of the last years I was still a registered lobbyist, I remember, I think I was even a staffer for one of the, it might have been a Senate staffer or House staffer. They're just like, "Yeah, Dan, everybody's a cannabis lobbyist this spring." And I was just like, "Really?" And they're just like, "Yeah, there's so many of them now." And I was like, "Huh, that's interesting." I mean, not that they were going to come and like talk to me in the first place, but a lot of the lobbyists down there knew who I was and what I was up to. But as soon as they get that contract with a client, then they can go have their meetings and coordinate with anybody they want to, or not coordinate with anybody they don't want to.
I imagine at the time being like, well, this seems like progress, but also annoying.
Yeah, I mean, and at certain points, we were just so close, but never really like getting it over the finish line. And that's also kind of like a trick of lobbyists, is to get really close, show that we're just about there, and then the spring legislative session ends. Okay, well now we got to get it over the finish line in veto session, or we got to do this again next spring. So sign another contract with me, and hopefully we get it done next time. So there's a certain advantage financially for lobbyists to be very close
Oh,
to
so
doing what they're supposed to do,
yeah, like
but
you're
never
almost
actually
saying
get it done.
that's like a business tactic that they use.
It can be, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. So that's cool to hear. I was curious if you noticed, yeah, that like kind of increase because the money started flowing, right? Just like
Yeah, I
it
mean, I
did with
saw
any.
lawmakers that voted against this bill when it was medical. I saw lawmakers that voted against legalizing medical cannabis in Illinois, who were then at some of the town halls before the state even had the applications out, who then applied for licenses. Um, you saw people like that who voted against it, but then wanted to get in on the industry after it became law.
Well, like a Pam Eltoff who voted against it and voted against
Yeah, she
medical
did vote
cannabis, and
for it a
then
couple of times, but
did
she
she?
also did
Okay.
vote against it. I know I wrote a letter to the Northwest Herald in Crystal Lake, putting her on blast when she voted against it. And then later on,
Good.
you're thanking her for your vote. And some people say you shouldn't do that, Dan. You're always trying to make friends and not burn bridges. But elected officials occasionally need to be held accountable for the votes that they take. And I thought that was one of them, especially because we had a patient in her district who had cancer, who was dying, and we met with her with that patient, and she privately supported the issue, but then she publicly voted against it. And you gotta remind people of that sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting to hear about. Phil, any other thoughts, kind of just in that vein? I wanted to give you space on that.
I don't think I need to share my thoughts about that.
Fair, fair.
I mean,
Um,
I'll say one thing, and somebody told me this, and it resonates with me, so that's why I'll share it. You have to give people space to change their mind. You have to give people that opportunity to adjust when the world changes around them. But at the same time, elected officials, I think there's a different standard with some of these things.
yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, I have interviewed Representative Carol Ammons. She's kind of a lot of her efforts and just where I'm a big fan of hers, and she is featured a few times in my mini documentary. If people want to check it out, I'll throw a link in the show notes or colememo.com/mini doc. And I'm under the impression that one of the things she did, at least before the CRTA, I know that the CRTA was discussed for multiple years, but in terms of 2019, I've heard that, the idea was to get some policy out there and maybe even be a little bit aspirational, maybe a little, you know, you just really push it so that you put these ideas out there. And as the Chicago Tribune reported at the time, there was a highly restrictive proposal in the works that had been, as I said, in the works for multiple years. I guess my question is, do you remember like what I'm talking about? Do you remember how outspoken she was about kind of what happened, I guess, and what was going on at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I was working closely with her, and I've known her and her husband Aaron since those early years, the early 2000s. So I go way back with the Ammons. Um, we were trying to do something much more aggressive in terms of making the people that would benefit from this be the ones who were directly impacted in a negative way. Um, but that was going to take a little bit more political willpower, and ultimately the courts may have shot it down anyways. Whereas the law that did end up passing, that had been chewed through by the lawyers for a number months or even a couple of years. And the lawyers at that table, including the lobbyists for some of the people in the medical world, they were able to make it something that they felt would withstand court challenges, as well as be in their favor and in their advantage. But yeah, I mean, with Representative Ammons, I mean, we were trying to do something that we felt was going to have the greatest positive impact for the people who had suffered the greatest from not just cannabis prohibition, but the war on drugs.
Yeah. And I mean, wasn't she of, I don't want to get this wrong, so Google this, but she was one of two people that voted against it. Mary Flowers included. Maybe there were, well,
I
there
think
was
she
probably
voted
like
present is the
Moylan.
way that I remember it. Uh,
Okay.
yeah,
She,
so it's not a no vote, it's not a yes vote, and I think some more like what actually happened. I think she was in line to make a speech while it was being debated, and kind of got snubbed, and they didn't let her make her appeal, and then they ran the bill for a vote, and it passed.
to your
That's
point,
that's that's my recollection of uh, why she would have voted present on that. Was she had some things to say. They didn't want her to muddy up the waters, so they didn't allow her to give her talk or to make her voice heard in the debate, and they ran the bill through anyways.
yeah, to your point, you are recalling that correctly because the final scene in my mini documentary is her speech that she gave, and she said, "I refuse to vote on a bill that would not allow me to speak to it."
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's a very strong position for an elected official to take. The people that elected her, the people that she represents, not just in her district, but for all of Illinois. Um, because it's not just the people in their district that they're voting for. They're voting for all Illinoisans when they're taking those votes. Those voices were silenced in that debate, really.
Yeah. And another thing she said, just to that I really appreciated, she said, because, you know, she said, I do appreciate the work that has been done to get to this point. I just don't think we've done enough to achieve justice and equity. And I would say that I'm of the same belief. And Phil said it earlier. Like we appreciate the progress that has been made. We're just, you know, it's not enough. It's not good enough, you know.
Yeah, and sometimes making progress, we end up setting up roadblocks for further progress.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I forgot to mention earlier that I think makes a point that you made that we discussed earlier much more powerful is the idea that in the medical cannabis law, there was no odor proof language. And in fact, that language was just muted myself, caught myself quick. That language was added to the adult use law, a completely new punishment. Just sort of interesting.
Yeah, like
You
the
know?
improper transport stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was some language in
I
there
I agree
for the
because
medical, but I
right.
think it was like from the transportation, from like the cultivation center to the dispensary, and then like the packaging itself was supposed to be odor proof. Like it didn't really put the burden on the patient or the consumer.
Yeah, I guess what I'm
Though
saying
they did have your license plate tagged if they were to run it.
that's
Your
another
driver's
good
license, yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, that's another good thing to remind folks of. Back in the day, if they ran your license plate, they could see. And I actually had an officer do this for me once when that was still the case. And when you look at it, when you looked at it at the time when they ran my plate, um, it like in the section where it would show where your concealed carry license is, right next to that is your medical cannabis cardholder status because it makes sense, right, to put those two right next to each other because they're equivalent in danger, right? I'm just trying to be funny. But anyways, to your point, yes, there was language about the container, but from what I understand, it's this idea of improper transport and it being a Class A misdemeanor that was created in the 2019 law. It's what we talked about in the episode that I mentioned earlier with the Supreme Court case, because that's part of the argument they use is like, well, he was a medical cannabis patient, so there's this language for the medical cannabis law, but then there's this language for the adult use cannabis law. So like, and anyways, good history.
Yeah.
to recap.
And I mean, the patients are still the only ones that are able to legally grow their own in Illinois. I talked to some old advocates who were around before I was, and they still feel that it's not legal in Illinois because they can't grow cannabis in their backyard or in their garden like they can everything else that they're growing.
Right. Right. Well, and the other idea, Phil, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say possession limits too.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one cool thing about the medical cannabis law that I did get the state to confirm is that we are a keep what you grow state. But I say that, and I've literally had people on my show that have been busted for having over 100 grams of cannabis in their house, and I'm talking to somebody else, in fact, that got caught with the same thing. So it's like, and they claim it was secured in the house, which is what the law says. All amounts over 30 grams. But they still got arrested for possession limit as a medical cannabis patient that was cultivating at home.
Yeah, I mean they should be on the evening news. I mean they should be sounding the alarm.
Sounds like they're going to be coming on the Cole Memo.
Yeah,
So
that's the start, right?
yeah, because the state has just absolutely fucked them, and they've totally complied with all the rules. But anyways, though, to your point, one of the things I find interesting actually about that, it's something else I asked the state about, and this would have applied. I watched a town hall with Representative Kelly Cassidy. It may have been with Heather Staines. If adult use, if all adults would have been allowed to cultivate at home, according to the town hall she gave, and I know that these things can change and maybe it was different. I don't know. But she said you would have to register as an adult with the Illinois Department of Agriculture to cultivate at home, which is something Missouri does. But I just still think this concept, it's like, why? What are we doing here? Like, why do we have to put our
Well,
names into a monitoring database?
but isn't that because the police want to be able to look up
True.
an address to be
Right.
like, are there supposed to be cannabis plants at this address? Because they want to be able to have probable cause to go in if there isn't.
Sure. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I mean bureaucracy loves more bureaucracy. I mean
True.
we're starting to run into that now with the psychedelic legislation where if these agencies are going to be tasked with regulating this, they need funding to pay the people that are going to do it. And some of us have been, well, we don't have to have them regulated either. We can let these things figure themselves out. But Illinois isn't a very libertarian state when it comes to any of these anything in general, especially these substances.
Yeah. I have, a question just generally about being a drug policy activist, but I wanted to fill anything else on Illinois cannabis history that we haven't really discussed yet. I mean, um, before we transition to psychedelics and stuff, what that future looks like.
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah. If anything comes up, don't be afraid to switch us back. I'm sure Dan, we like mushrooms and cannabis, right? So let's talk about them both. But anyways, my question that I have for you, Dan, and if you got to get back to me on this one, it's okay. But how do you stay positive and charged as a drug policy activist, besides, of course, taking drugs?
Well, you answered the first part there. In my career as a drug policy reform activist, the people that you meet that just are absolutely inspiring, people that have medical conditions that are just very debilitating, but they were still willing to get to the Capitol and talk to lawmakers and have faith in the political process. Because there's a lot of people that are just politically jaded in Illinois and across the country. And to see people that really believe in the beauty of America and being able to have your voice heard and make these changes, that's inspiring. Knowing when I was pen pals with somebody that was doing hard time, knowing that I had the opportunity to make their life better, that was something that was very empowering for me. And there's something about being, I feel like on the right side of history. You look at how these laws were enacted, you look at what they've done to different communities and different populations, and seeing how it's slowly unraveling and wanting to be a part of that process and wanting to be a part of that movement. Even if you're just a a foot soldier reversing the war on drugs. There's still a place for that. And, for me, I didn't realize there were so few people doing it until I got involved. And then as I got involved, you get more involved. And, if you're not going to do it, who is really? You can't wait for the next person to wake up in the morning and say they want to change this law.
Yeah. It's just something the reason I ask, it's something I struggle with sometimes because it's like, I feel like privileged as hell and I should just shut my mouth because like I can just go buy weed at a store and stuff. Like what's the big deal? But I also think sometimes like that's exactly what that attitude, it's too easy to fall into that attitude, and that causes what I think is some of what we're dealing with today with especially cannabis policies, like apathy, where it's like, yeah, just go to the fucking store, like what's the big deal,
Yeah,
And
but I think there's also, there's, like in, to kind of use the metaphor of like a war. I mean, you got the foot soldiers that are charging full speed ahead and
mhm.
changing these laws, but then you need to have that like second line of reinforcements that come and fine tune it, that make it better, and that point out the imperfections that still need to be addressed because, none of these laws are perfect, and
Mhm.
even after we have federal legalization, there's probably going to be even more room for improvement as these states try and
Yeah.
figure out now how they're dealing with interstate commerce. And these licensees in Illinois are going to start complaining about what their fees are compared to the people in other states that don't have to pay the fees and deal with the security systems that they're dealing with.
Right. Like they're doing with hemp today.
I
Yeah,
Right.
was going to say,
that was
what's your
something we didn't
opinion
get
on
into
hemp?
earlier, but yeah, I mean, you saw the battle between the multi-state operators in Illinois and the infancy of the hemp industry. And, you still see all sorts of products and gas stations that are of questionable quality and standardization.
One of the questions I just thought of that, like it's hard to put it into words, but like what was the end? Because I get this sense, and I like I have this like idea of what once was, right? And I get the sense that there was like this normal crew, including you. I used to see like I don't know if you know this person, but I'm sure you do. Kelvin McCabe. He was always like posting on social media, and I really credit him for a lot of the foundation of my understanding of the cannabis law, and like how it came to be and everything else. He's just very extremely transparent and well said and everything, all of his commentary. But I'm just curious, it's like all of you got out, it seems like, and I don't mean to say got out because you're obviously still in the drug policy arena, but like that whole crew, it's like different. And I'm just curious, like, was it because of what happened with the CRTA and just like how limited what we got was, or was it just like what was the end like, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah,
Like I
I
say,
mean,
it's hard to ask that question, but
it's
like,
it's different for everybody. Some people
sure.
had families, they
Right.
said young children that they wanted to spend more time with. Some people moved out of state. Some people died. Some people, their health worsened and prevented them from staying involved. And at a certain point, I feel like you just gotta, you gotta pass the torch. You got young activists that are extremely motivated. They're not jaded yet. They have the energy and they want to do something. And part of the role of being a leader is to make more leaders. Not to make more followers, but you want to have more leaders that can then continue on with the work and continue on with the progress.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I figured as much. Just like I guess I was more so asking from your perspective because it's hard to obviously speak for like everybody else. But yeah, I didn't know if like at the end you shared like a similar view as Carol Ammons, which is like, look, we made good progress, but god damn, this is a little frustrating,
Yeah, no, I mean, I felt that way. Sometimes you sprint through a finish line, and other times you just like drag yourself across it, and then you're done. And I was able to, relinquish my leadership role, right before legalization actually took effect, after the law had passed, but before it was implemented, because I knew once when it was implemented, there was going to be a host of issues and while I could go on the different, media circuits talking about it, give somebody else that opportunity. People get tired of hearing my voice and seeing me, talk about the same things and same problems, and other people offer a different perspective. And I think that that's very valuable to see the different positions that people come from, and what their views are with the imperfections in these laws.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for taking that brief tangent. Yeah, the hemp thing was definitely interesting to see play out, because it's like in many ways, a lot of the complaints that we have about cannabis legalization, like possession limits, dosage caps, purchase limits, not being able to use our credit card, not being able to get it delivered to our house,
The ease of
like,
starting a business.
right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
got like these sodas with 50 milligrams of THC. You just like get them sent to your house. It's like, damn, it's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
But I mean, there was a time before we allowed farmers in Illinois to grow hemp, before that law had passed, where I would do a legislative hemp reception in Springfield, which is really just a party that you're wining and dining lawmakers, lobbyists, and anybody at the Capitol. And I would cater the event myself. I was making hemp seed tamales, and we would get a keg of hemp beer from one of the breweries down in St. Louis, or whoever was making it that season. But the Dr. Bronner's folks would send us a bunch of like small hemp soap samples, and we would pass those out at the Capitol. And there were lawmakers and their staff who thought they were going to get high washing their hands with the hemp soap. So just for a little perspective in terms of where we've come from. But I remember even with the like invitation for that event, we would talk about how all of the products that we used in the food were legally purchased in Illinois, but farmers in Illinois were not legally allowed to grow them. And that none of the products would make you fail a drug test or get you any type of level of intoxication. So even just the invitation to the event, we were educating the lawmakers and the other people mingling about the Capitol.
Interesting. Do you remember Hash Wednesday? Did you participate in Hash Wednesday?
Yeah, there was definitely a Hash Wednesday at the Champaign-Urbana campus of the University of Illinois that I
Fuck
attended.
yeah. Yeah. Do you remember what years?
Maybe 2001.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. I might have pictures of so I've did a Hash Wednesday series, and I've got pictures of Hash Wednesday over the years from like newspaper clippings and people that participated that have contributed photos of the proceedings.
Yep.
And aka smoking weed on the quad. Um, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if I have any pictures from 2001, but in the pictures that I do have, it's often the speakers. Did you speak, or did you just participate?
That first one, no. But we used to do a global marijuana march the first weekend in May, and we would organize that in Chicago. And there's definitely some YouTube video footage of me speaking at those events.
Super cool. Super cool. Well, anyways, the Cure Act, we can close out on that. One of the things that I love about the Cure Act, I've talked to LaShawn Ford on the show about this, is like the concept of multiple points of access, right? So you have that therapeutic, safe route. And is it still like, obviously, you can do it for therapeutic reasons, but can you also just be like, I want to experience one of these experiences type of thing?
There is a little bit of a barrier to just gaining access to the product, as far as I understand. And then because it has to be done at the service center, that also kind of limits the ability for somebody to just buy it and take it home and do it wherever they want. So I think that that's kind of also a safeguard. Not that I think that's not the best term, but that's part of the reasoning, I think, is to keep people just using it on site.
Well, because I know originally when I heard about the Cure Act, like descheduling was part of it. Is that not part of the?
No, I believe it's still part of it, and then also the like decriminalizing it for personal use, which I think is probably going to have a much. I mean, obviously the therapeutic route will help a lot of people that need that help, but just decriminalizing the possession amount for everyday consumers, I think is going to be really, really advantageous for the state of Illinois.
Yeah.
Well, and the last I heard about, like, because I think in like Oregon they have like mushroom clinics you can go to. The last I heard was that a lot of them were doing horribly, and it's like not a sustainable business. So, like, you would think, hey, if you can just get this passed, maybe eventually they'll liberalize it and make it a business that can actually be sustainable.
Yeah, and I think that that's, part of that is that you have people that are already doing mushrooms and they can do it at a party, they can do it at their house, they can do it out in nature. And then you have other people that are suffering from some of these ailments who have never done it before and they need to have like a sitter with them or they want to be in that controlled environment. Um, but the overall market, I think, is much larger for the people that just want to be able to buy it and take it and do it wherever they want to go. But that's why if you're, especially if we kind of modeled it after like the Illinois medical cannabis market, where you have these huge barriers to entry for the business, and then you have these service centers, and then they're dealing with one or two people a day. Like, yeah, they're not going to be able to pay rent. They're not going to be able to pay a staff with, 3 or 4 clients unless they're charging those clients a crazy
Right.
amount of money. But that's also not going to have the biggest benefit for the people that really need access to this medicine.
Yeah.
What substances does the Cure Act cover?
So it covers psilocybin, so the mushrooms, DMT, ibogaine, and mescaline, but not peyote. So there's a little bit of a carve out for not including peyote.
I can't remember. Does Illinois already have like a ketamine program?
Yeah, so there are ketamine clinics that exist already in Illinois, and one of the panelists that we had at the event last week, she runs one and kind of gave us an overview of how that operates, and it seems like they're doing well.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
I think
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah. We just
But
had,
like you said with like the Oregon, if the because I mean these facilities are going to be, it's not like you're running a hotel with 100 rooms with 100 people getting, access to this at one time and 100 sitters overseeing them. Like there's going to be a very small amount of people on a regular basis being able to access this. So the model for like making lots of money isn't going to be there unless you're gouging those patients on each visit. Now, if you were to combine it with a dispensary model, if you can buy it and take it with you, then that opens the door for them to be much more profitable.
yeah. Isn't it, am I wrong in thinking there's like, that license thing, but it's not necessarily, like you say, use is decriminalized. So like you couldn't charge for a session. You can't be like, I'm a mushroom guru. Let's all trip mushrooms together. But you could hypothetically arrange for that because the use would be decriminalized.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some loopholes in terms of, you're making a charitable donation, and with your donation, you get X, Y, and Z product that contains the substance.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, they've been there. Those type of workarounds were kind of like in those Gen 1 cannabis states in some places, whereas, you buy $100 T-shirt, you just get a free half ounce of cannabis with it.
I mean, yeah, that's like, well, I could be wrong. I was going to say for at least for a while, it was largely how DC operated, like Washington, DC,
Yeah.
That type of market. So that's interesting. Yeah. So, the descheduling, it seems like a much better approach. It seems like we should have done that with cannabis, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and on the state level, part of the reluctance to just like make these sweeping changes is that there was kind of an unwritten rule that if you were going to increase penalties for these substances, that you kind of took like a stair step approach. So what used to be a class 4 is now a class 3 felony. What was a class 3 felony is now a class 2. And then they also kind of kept that in place for like the reverse then. So when they were lowering these penalties, they kind of wanted to like lower them in that same type of like stair stepping or one at a time kind of place. But I mean, I know we had legislation drafted that was, you could have 10 pounds and it was going to be a class 4 felony, but then anything less than 10 pounds was nothing.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't even know. I never bought pounds of mushrooms, so
Yeah.
by
But
the
that's
eighth.
where that's just like like I said, it's kind of like an unwritten rule in the
Sure.
legislature that they try and make slow, gradual changes as opposed to these broad changes.
That's interesting to know. I've never really heard that that's like an ethos that they operate under. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean, and
it makes a lot of sense the way you see how they do things.
yeah, and that's where they're kind of they kind of tiptoe around these issues. And I think that's also why the public can be kind of politically jaded, is because sometimes the public is far ahead of the lawmakers and they want to see these broad changes, but the elected officials, and some of it's just in like deference to their colleagues that are in tougher districts, they want to make it more palatable for them to vote for these things and not face this issue in a reelection campaign. But yeah, I mean, that's where, you don't see as broad changes as a lot of the public would like with, well, not just drug policy reform, but with issues in general.
Yeah, it's interesting. Any thoughts on like federal cannabis reform? Do you keep in the loop on that at all?
I mean, a little bit. At the beginning of the year, I was telling people I thought that they were going to do the rescheduling or descheduling before the election to turn out the youth vote. Once when the president decided that he was not going to run and the vice president filled those shoes, now I could see why they don't want to touch the issue before the election. But I would think that, I would think after the election, I would think if either candidate gets in within 2 or 3 years, you'd probably see rescheduling. I've also been saying 2 or 3 or 4 years for 20 years. So, take that with a grain of salt. So, again, I think that I think that the Congress is there, but then you got the bureaucracy of the DEA. You got how some of these things have been able to finance other operations in government and in other countries. But I mean, like the UN Council on Drugs, you look at, what Mexico has done, you look at, places like British Columbia, Canada, and what they've done with decriminalizing drugs, obviously Portugal, the appetite is there across the globe. They're just waiting for the US because we're the biggest consumers of drugs. And we were also the ones championing these draconian drug laws for a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
exactly.
mean, federal level. I mean, I still think we're close, um, and I think that's where how that happens now is going to be the real interesting thing. Does it go to a Schedule 3? Does it get fully descheduled? And how does that ripple effect impact all these states?
Right. Yeah, I've always felt like the short, like the speculation that I've heard that seems most accurate is like, you'll see maybe more loosening of creating cannabis medicines like Marinol and everything else that have fallen into Schedule 3. But then you'll have like if it's a Harris administration or whatever, you'll have like a new Cole memo or Garland memo because if it's Attorney General Merrick Garland, and it's like you probably have this bifurcated approach like we already have, really. Like again, there's medical cannabis options now, Epidiolex, Marinol, I think a third, and those are Schedule 3 drugs, but we also have these systems, these patchwork of systems that the federal government just kind of looks the other way on, you know. I just feel like that's probably what it's going to be like for the foreseeable future. I don't see this, because a lot of people have this doomsday portrayal of rescheduling, like, oh, big pharma's going to come in and shut all the dispensaries down. It's like I don't think like a lot of these companies have deep vested interests, and I know that big pharma maybe overshadows that in many ways, but I just think that we're going to see the same old, same old.
Yeah, and I mean, and even if the feds did deschedule or reschedule, a lot of the states that have these laws on the books already, they've already kind of like set the table a little bit of how other people will need to operate in Illinois. And even if you look at like the history of how alcohol prohibition ended, with Illinois having the three-tiered system of the manufacturers, the distributors, and then the actual retailers. I mean, that's basically what we kind of have with cannabis, just a little differently. But they could still make that same type of paradigm exist for if you wanted to sell cannabis in Illinois at one of our licensed dispensaries, this is what we need from a cultivation center in Michigan. It needs to be lab tested. It needs to be transported with these type of same protocols. And then when it's in our seed to sale tracking system, we can then allow a dispensary in Illinois to sell Michigan cannabis.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I know it's starting to get late and we've gone a little bit over an hour. So we should do this again sometimes, talk
Yeah.
cannabis and policy as things move forward. There's a lot of topics that we didn't even discuss. Like we kind of touched on lab testing, but uh,
What is like the timetable on the Cure Act? Like, what's the
yeah.
progress with that?
I don't expect much to happen during veto session or a lame duck session, so we're looking at next spring. That being said, sometimes these things do move quickly during a lame duck session because you have lawmakers that aren't facing a reelection and they can vote however they want to, and sometimes there's some horse trading going on with that. But I would think that next spring we're going to come back at it and see how far we can get. The numbers look good in the Senate. The House, we still need to do a lot of work on.
Gotcha. One of the things that I found so refreshing to hear is that you have like support from law enforcement and stuff like that, which is not something that we had going for cannabis. It is interesting how the idea of psychedelics is much more palatable in many ways than cannabis for people.
It is a different world, we will say. Talking to some of these groups that, in my memory, were telling people that the sky was going to fall if we let sick people have access to cannabis, and here we are, and now they're okay with us letting people do mushrooms under a specific setting.
Well, I wonder too, like if they have less of a problem with like decriminalizing mushrooms because mushrooms don't have a profound odor that allows them to get into any car they want if they claim they smell it.
Yeah, and I think something else could be that they, cannabis just had such a attachment and stigma of the old hippies against, the Vietnam War era, whereas mushrooms are a little bit less in that same wheelhouse for some of these old people that are still in places of power. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to me, at least.
Well, and everybody's talking
I'll
about.
take it.
I'm not about it.
As exactly, I was gonna say like let's take it because everybody's talking about like microdosing and everything else. So it's like let's ride the wave. It's really interesting to hear how many people are like open to the idea of psychedelics nowadays, and it reminds me a lot of medical cannabis, but like you say, there's just something different about it, and it's refreshing in a way. It's like what is this the Great Awakening?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the war on drugs, you can kind of start to see the other side retreating a little bit. Is the way I think of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, Dan, would love to have you back on in the future. Would love to definitely chop up more topics. Like I said, we didn't even get to like cannabis testing standards and things like that. It's something we talk about on the show. And like I say, there's so much more we haven't chopped up. So I'll definitely have to follow up with you. I wanted to give you the space. Any closing thoughts or anything you wanted to say before we go?
No, it's been a pleasure. It's been a great conversation, Cole and Phil, and let's do this again sometime soon. And the Illinois Psychedelic Society is going to keep pushing for the Cure Act to go through. So maybe in the springtime, as we make some progress, we can give you some updates.
Perfect. Well, I just wanted to thank you again for doing what you have done to push forward policy, drug policy in Illinois. And, I'm sure it's reverberated and you've left an impression on many other people. Like I said, I've heard so many good things about you, and I'm sure it's, had the same effect on them. So thank you for doing what you do. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Yep. All right, folks. I hope you found value in this episode of the Cole Memo. We'll see you on the next one. Tried to light the joint, but it didn't work. It's all right. We'll see you on the next episode. Take care.
Bye-bye.